Hi, I'm Arahi,
I'm Isra.
and the article that we did is called Possessing Nature, the Female in Frankenstein by Anne K. Mellor. And the guiding question that's kind of framing the whole article is, how does Mary Shelley link patriarchal control over women and reproduction to the domination of nature in Frankenstein, and what other alternatives does the novel propose?
So, with Miller's central argument, she contends that the same logic that subordinates women also drives Victor to violate nature, and that these two ways of thinking are inseparable. So the novel reinforces the cultural encoding of women as passive and denies the value of women and their sexuality. So Victor removes female reproductive control through his creation, which further reduces the place and importance of women in society. And this actually just effectively eliminates the needs for females and creates the possibility for a male-only society. And so Shelley warns us about the consequences of a society that values men above women, which leads us to Miller's foundational theory. And so with this, we've split this up into 5 parts.
Yeah, so the first part is kind of talking about Mellor's theory of gender construction and a public and private divide. And basically, the author's arguing that Frankenstein reflects a cultural system in which femininity, which is associated with both women and nature, is constructed in a more like domestic field, and it's very inferior to men, who in turn occupy positions of authority. And this type of society creates very rigid separation between men and women and the public and the private spheres, but the separation really isn't natural, and that's what leads to a lot of this destruction.
So characters like Justine, Elizabeth, and Caroline shine a light on this structure because they're valued for their devotion and their self-sacrifice, which men aren't expected to do, but they're not involved in any meaningful decision-making.
Yeah, and Mellor kind of argues that this construction goes past just women themselves, and it's kind of linked to nature, where nature is often treated as something passive and something that people can control, and it really isn't.
Yeah, so this parallel between women and nature positions them both as objects to be possessed and exploited, which lays the foundation for Victor's desire to control creation through his scientific pursuits. And so this leads us to part 2, which is Victor's experiment, which is eliminating women and the fear of female autonomy. So within this framework, Victor's creation of life represents an attempt to just completely eliminate women from reproduction entirely. And so he transforms reproduction into a male-centered process, reflecting a patriarchal desire to remove dependence on women and replace natural creation with scientific reproduction.
Yeah, and also, like, in addition to women, he also tries to override nature itself and become a creator. And this desire to pretty much control nature in both women is very visible when Victor considers creating a female companion for the creature, but he ultimately ends up destroying her in a fit of rage. And his reasoning for doing this is because he thinks that this female creature might refuse to obey him, or that she's going to be very, much more dangerous than the original creature was.
And so these fears expose a broader ideological concern, because Victor horror isn't coming from, an actual possibility of danger, but it's coming from the possibility of losing patriarchal control over both women and the natural processes that they represent. So what Victor really truly fears is female sexuality. He fears a woman who is sexually liberated and free to choose her own way of life and what she wants to do. And so the way he mutilates the female creature he had begun creating suggests a violent control over the female body. And Mellor actually reads this as evoking rape, read that he tears her to pieces, trembling with passion, and the next morning reflects on the remains that lay scattered about, as if I had mangled the living flesh of a human being.
Yeah, I think it's kind of important to note that Victor really didn't have to kill this female creature as violently or excessively that he chose to do it. And the fact that he did kind of portrays, once again, his obsessive need to, garner control over females. And this kind of leads into part 3 of this article, where Mellor talks about women as victims and the suppression of female sexuality in general. And I think she's kind of saying, overall, the consequences of this patriarchal system unfolds throughout the novel in the suffering of many female characters. So, for example, Justine is wrongfully accused of killing William, as one example, but then also Elizabeth isn't able to help her because of her role in a more private sphere, and Elizabeth is also just ultimately murdered and cannot fight back. And this is also seen with Caroline's life and how her life is defined by self-sacrifice, because she dies unnecessarily because she feels obligated to nurse Elizabeth back to health during the smallpox epidemic.
Yeah, and so all three of these deaths can be directly attributed to Victor's own selfishness and his own concern for his own suffering and reputation. And Victor's rejection of feminine values like empathy and responsibility leads him to abandon his creation, which sets in motion the violent events of this novel. However, this also reflects a broader separation between masculine ambition and female ethics, because masculine ambition in terms of scientific pursuit is detached from any moral responsibility, which results in more destruction rather than any progress.
Yeah, and also kind of like moving on, female sexuality in Frankenstein is very repressed in Victor's world, and you can kind of see it by how all the female characters in his life are kind of presented as essentially without romantic involvement. So, for example, Caroline is just presented as a very devoted mother, and Elizabeth is framed as a sister, not as a wife. And one of the only romantic moments he actually has with Elizabeth is when Elizabeth actually gets killed on their wedding night, and he embraces her with ardor. And this is the only time in the novel he shows true romantic or sexual feeling toward her, which kind of shows how he didn't really have any romantic feelings for her. And it's also kind of like important to note how Elizabeth is also seen as an object throughout most of the novel, because even when she's first brought into the Frankenstein home, Victor's mom describes her as a pretty present for him.
Yeah, and so according to Melly, this scene of Elizabeth's death is framed by Mary Shelley around Fuseli's painting The Nightmare, which is the image of a woman inanimate, presumably dead, draped across a bed, which signals that Victor's most profound erotic desire is necrophilic, and it's a desire to possess the dead female, one he substitutes for his lost mother. And so for the fact that the Victor didn't even consider that the creature might attack Elizabeth, assuming it would only come for him, reveals how blinded he was by his own self-concern and selfishness, and highlights his lack of care for those around him, especially females.
Yeah, and this kind of also goes along with how Victor is really shown to be in relationships that are most passionate with men and not women. And this is seen first in how he describes Henry Clerval as an image of his former self, and as his friend and dearest companion, and eventually his true soulmate. And then also when he's creating this creature, Victor dedicates himself to this experiment entirely, and he even describes it as the great object of my affection, and he even ends up confessing that he couldn't stop himself from creating this creature, and he says he became as timid as a lovesick girl.
Yeah, so he's creating a male creature, so this reveals his homoerotic tendencies, but also his contempt for femininity, identifying timidness as a feminine concept, but also something to be looked down upon. And so the creature is often read as a manifestation of Victor's true self, and so when the creature murders Elizabeth, it exposes his repressed desire to rape, control, and just destroy female autonomy, a desire that he also expresses to nature, which has serious consequences.
Yeah, and that kind of builds into the fourth part of this article where Victor performs an assault on nature. And really throughout the novel, Shelley shows that Victor's actions have serious consequences, and she shows this through the fact that nature really isn't passive and a thing that Victor can just violate. And it's seen as how nature resists Victor's urge to create the creature and eventually exacts revenge on Victor.
So first off, for nature resisting, nature prevents Victor from constructing a normal human being. An unnatural production method creates an unnatural result. You know, the creature is huge. He has watery eyes. He has straight black lips and a shriveled complexion. However, the structure of this creature also points to Victor's lack of care and responsibility, because Victor had complete control over what this creature would look like. And it's also mentioned in the book that Victor chose to use bigger parts, making the creature abnormally big, because that was easier for him to work with. He did not consider the impact that this would have on the creature, and this really shows that he lacks the empathy that's often associated with the feminine sphere.
Yeah, so Shelley also shows nature to kind of pursue Victor and enact revenge from him. And it's kind of shown as nature fighting back against Victor with the very electricity that he stole from nature to create the creature, to create a living being and a pulse. And this is seen throughout the novel as aspects of nature like lightning, thunder, and heavy rain kind of rage all around him throughout the book at different times. And for example, one of the times it does this is the night that he steals the spark of being from nature to finish creating the creature is a dark and wet night, and is described as the rain poured from a black and comfortless sky.
And so he sees the creature for a second time with the strike of lightning in the Alps. And significantly, the Alps, or Mont Blanc and specifically, is often represented as female. So this is significant because it reinforces female as a powerful feminine force. On his wedding day, Victor admires the beautiful Mont Blanc and the assemblage of snowy mountains that in vain endeavor to emulate her.
Yeah, and then when he leaves the island where he destroyed the female creature, he wakes up to fierce winds and high waves that portend his own death. And then lastly, he kind of ends his life in the Arctic. And it's important to note that he's surrounded by the electromagnetic field of the North Pole, and the atmospheric effects of this of the novel manifests like nature's power to punish those who try to go past the limits, and the kind of the elemental forces that he released when he was creating the creature are the elements that turn their back on him and pursue him till his death.
Yeah, and so this just creates an ironic twist where the same forces that he attempted to control get back at him. And so we see this by nature punishing Victor's health and legacy, because during his research and experimentation, nature denies Victor both his mental and physical health. He has fever, anxiety attacks, bouts of delirium, periods of distraction, and madness. And so when he attempts to defy nature a second time by creating a female, it said that the eternal twinkling of the stars weighed upon him, and his mental illness returns yet again. And so his obsession exposes him to such mental and physical fatigue that he dies by the age of 25.
Yeah, and it's also kind of important to note that nature's most, I guess, like its biggest punishment on Victor is how he loses his capacity for natural procreation. And this is kind of seen in how Elizabeth is eventually murdered on their wedding night, and it kind of cuts off his chance to have children and have Victor live on through them. This punishment is also seen when the creature destroys not only Elizabeth, but also William, Clerval, Justine, and to that extent, his father, who was grief-stricken and died because of that.
However, nature does reward those who cultivate her. We see this in the younger Victor before his obsession, where he could respond powerfully to nature's beauty. In Clerval's company, he becomes this version of himself again, and he becomes the same happy creature who a few years ago, loving and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care.
Yeah, and Clerval functions as another type of foil to Victor throughout the novel, because Victor is seen as wanting to dominate and extract from the natural world, but Clerval simply just wants to enjoy it and learn more about it. And I think Shelley here is kind of drawing a deliberate contrast between two models of what it means to be curious about the world and what it means to be obsessed with something.
Yeah, and so we see this with Clerval's relationship with nature, which is one of pure love, as he loved with ardor the scenery of external nature. And nature endows him with sympathy, imagination, and a great capacity for friendship. However, his death eliminates any last chance for Victor to have a positive relationship with nature, because Henry was his last connection with nature and a type of goodness.
Yeah, nature is also seen as rewarding because Ernest Frankenstein, who's the only member of the Frankenstein family to survive, actually ended up being a farmer. And because he's like cultivating the land, it can be kind of interpreted as because he's giving something to nature, nature is giving him something back.
Yeah, and so Meller also talks about nature as an ecological system of interdependent organisms, and it requires the submission of one's ego for the welfare of the family and the larger community. So we see this with Clerval, who gives up his desire to attend university to help nurse Victor back to life. We see this with Elizabeth, who offers to release Victor from their engagement if he loves another. And we see this with the Russian sea master that Walton mentions, that willingly sacrifices his own desires so that his beloved can be with the man that she loves.
Yeah, and all these three examples share a willingness to sacrifice something for yourself and to prioritize someone else's well-being over your personal ambition for the better of the community. And with Victor, he can't do that.
Yeah, Victor just really can't sacrifice anything. Not his experiment for his family. He can't sacrifice his reputation for Justine's life. He can't sacrifice his obsession for Elizabeth. Every time he is given the opportunity to place his family and relationships above his own ambition, he fails to do so, and someone eventually ends up dying for it. And so Shelley views this as a value that the patriarchal world actively cultivates in men like Victor, and one that makes genuine connection both with people and nature impossible.
Yeah, and kind of in contrast to this, the fifth part of this article really talks about an alternative model to a societal structure, and that's the DeLacy family. And the DeLacy family offers an alternative social structure that's very much based on mutual care and emotional connection rather than patriarchy and domination.
Yeah, so their relationships are grounded in interdependence. Each member contributes to the well being of the family. We see this as the children willingly starve themselves so their blind father can eat. Unlike Victor's isolated and individualistic pursuit of knowledge, the DeLacy's demonstrate a new way of living that integrates relational care with, daily survival, which is a much more balanced and humane system. So, this model implicitly challenges the patriarchal knowledge that separates and hierarchizes masculine and feminine roles. And Shelley's contending here that these values have to coexist rather than be divided.
Yeah, and then the article kind of connects this to more broader feminist ethics, where Meller argues that Shelley's moral vision falls into what Carol Gilligan, a theorist, identifies as a characteristically female ethical tradition. And Gilligan argues that men tend to identify moral laws as abstract principles that differentiate right from wrong, but women tend to see moral choice as embedded in ongoing shared life. And how a female ethic of care rests on the premise of nonviolence and that no one should be hurt.
And so this same theory can also be traced to theorists like Nancy Chodorow and Dorothy Dinnerstein, who both contend that in a family structure wherein the son learns to separate himself from the mother and assert independence, while daughters learn to represent that gendered role and remain more tightly bound to community and care. And so the Frankenstein family embodies this masculine model where there's a hierarchical structure in which the rights of the individual are prioritized. We see this when Victor can leave his family obligations to go pursue his studies and is even encouraged by his father to do so. However, the DeLacy family embodies the more feminine egalitarian model, which is an interdependent structure embedded in female care, where all the members provide for each other with duty and gentleness.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to note that this alternative social structure eventually fails because the DeLacy family flees with Sophia. And the reason they flee is because the creature scares them. And because the creature is a manifestation of Victor himself, I think this fleeing kind of represents Victor's opposition to a more equitable society and kind of reinforces his need for patriarchal control.
Yeah, and the loss of this gestures towards what a more equitable social order might look like, even as the novel mourns its impossibility.
Yeah, and I think kind of overall, Meller is ultimately arguing that Frankenstein critiques patriarchal power, and it does this by exposing how Victor's drive to control and dominate women in nature leads to his total destruction as a society built on the exclusion of feminine values cannot sustain the life that it creates.
Shelley's novel ultimately proposes, through contrast, that creation and human relationships can only survive through interdependence, ethical responsibility, and a balance between masculine and feminine forces.
Yeah, and Miller's final point is that at every level, Victor Frankenstein is engaged in an assault on nature and his own repressed desire to possess and destroy the female, and in the end, nature ends up destroying him. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all. Thanks for listening.